Welcome to the Harvard Business Review IdeaCast. I'm Sarah Green. I'm here today with Harvard Business School's Tarun Khanna, co-author of Winning in Emerging Markets, a roadmap for strategy and execution. Tarun, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you, Sarah.
So let's start with maybe your definition of what an emerging market is, because there are some competing definitions.
I think we take the term emerging market very seriously. That is, it literally is a market that isn't quite there yet, but is on the way to getting there. That is, it's emerging. What I mean by that is a market at the end of the day, think of the grocery market, is a place where you go to buy something. So it must do whatever it needs to do to get the buyer and seller together. In other words, it must be able to inform you as to where the groceries are, and the seller of the groceries needs to know where the buyers are. So information is an important component. And finally, when you buy the groceries and you put it in your bag and take it home, you ought to hang on to it and know that you have rights over the groceries that you just bought. You don't want somebody to grab them and run away with it. And that's essentially what a market is. You need information and property rights. And what we define an emerging market to be is any situation where either of those two items are underdeveloped, which turns out to be most of the world. So we have a very structural definition of emerging markets, as opposed to the existing definitions out there which are correct and descriptive, but a little bit tautological. In other words, they say an emerging market is one that's poor or fast-growing or things like that. That doesn't really tell you what to do with it, other than noting that, yes, in fact, it's poor and fast-growing. Whereas our definition tells you, here's the structure, here are the things that are problematic, and here's what you do about each of these things.
And is the structural focus an attempt to sort of solve the problem where you're talking about emerging markets, but that's a term that people use for Brazil, for India, for all these other countries, and those are obviously very different from each other, but they also have very diverse populations within them.
Yes, the idea is to provide a simple way to get a map of a particular location. So our position would be that there are a lot of commonalities between the big emerging markets, the so-called BRIC countries, or you add South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, Mexico, places like that into it, that are all vibrant, that they all have different kinds of issues that put them into the bucket of emerging markets. There are some commonalities across the class, but of course, as you pointed out, it's very different running a business in Sao Paulo from one in Jakarta or Beijing. And our structural definition allows you to understand what aspects of the structure are common across these places, as well as what's different across them as a class of locations from New York and London.
Now, you've talked in the book about something you call institutional voids. Is that part of your structural definition?
Yes, that's the central construct in some sense. It's a bit of a mouthful, but void simply is something that's missing, right? And so we say that if a particular thing that you take for granted, say a bank seems like such a natural thing to think about. You and I can deposit money in the bank with a click of a mouse, or walk into and talk to a teller, or we can withdraw money or take a loan, etc. That bank is an intermediary between buyers of capital, people who want to use the capital, and sellers of capital, in other words, people who deposit their money in the bank, to keep it very simple. Now, that very elementary function of financial intermediation doesn't work in many parts of, to pick an extreme example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or even in parts of Nigeria when there's violence all around, or during the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, when people were withdrawing money hand over fist, worrying about the solvency of the banks. Or frankly, in our own neighborhood, not too long ago, when people were worried about banks failing. So the failure of the banks would be an example of an institutional void in the market for debt capital. So an institutional void is simply an institution that is void or missing.
And are you saying that different emerging markets may have different voids, and that's something that businesses looking to grow in those markets need to be aware of?
Yes, that's exactly correct, that the voids are different in different places. And so it's not helpful to say that a market is emerging. It is a very aggregate description that, in my experience, working with companies and entrepreneurs and investors and so on, it doesn't really tell them what to do on Monday morning. Take Korea, for example. It's not technically an emerging market by, say, the IFC definition, because it's an OECD country. But I would say that the market for equity capital until very recently has been very poorly functioning. On the other hand, its product markets are extremely well functioning. Chile, on the other hand, which is an emerging market in Latin America, has the opposite issue, which is its capital markets worked really well, and its product markets are perhaps a bit more deficient. So it really depends, and the point of the structural definition is to get a very clear map before you make any big investment decisions or management decisions.
Okay, so my second question to you on that issue of intermediaries and voids is that in the book you have a good metaphor for describing some of this stuff, the way companies tackle these challenges, which is you talk about the experience of people traveling to those countries. And I was wondering if you could maybe walk through that metaphor a little bit with us, sort of to just hammer this home.
So a simple related example would be if I want to plan a trip across the United States as a backpacking student, let's say. It's been a while since I was a backpacking student, but if I were a backpacking student, I would simply go on the web, I imagine, and start to get a list of places that I could stay at, which may be as simple as cheapo campgrounds to very high-end hotels, depending on my financial means. And I would perhaps go to a rental car agency, rent a car. I would go to some sort of web-based travel agency and book some tickets. In other words, I would be relying on all these existing intermediaries, which, by the way, all have competition, forcing them to do a good job, and they all have regulation in the background to make sure that they don't abuse their customers. Whereas if I were doing the same thing across rural India or sub-Saharan Africa or the Andes Mountains in Latin America, why there wouldn't be very much web coverage to get me this information. There certainly wouldn't be Avis and Hertz car rental agencies standing by to give me cars at a moment's notice, even if I had gold-plated privileges in those companies. And there probably wouldn't be too many flights that were reliable. So all those would be voids that would prevent my journey from happening as smoothly or efficiently as it would happen in the United States. And that would mean that I would need to spend more time on it. I would need to be carrying much more equipment with me. I would need backup plans, and I would just organize my trip very differently.
So you mentioned that you do work with companies on some of these issues. So can you give us maybe a company example that translates some of what we've talked about into the business side?
Sure, lots of great examples. There's a German wholesaler, which is, I want to say, a 60 billion euro company, Metro Group, that has its biggest division is called Metro Cash and Carry. Think of it as a Sam's Club for small businesses. Right? So it doesn't sell to you and me, the individual consumer. It sells to businesses. I've been working with them now for 5 or 6 years, helping them to craft their plans and with the execution of their strategies across a range of Asian countries. And what's interesting is that you have to balance a tension between adapting their model of having these stores and building the supply chains to get the goods and services that they need to their customers, to each of China, India, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, places like that. And you want to localize it to adapt to the institutional voids. But on the other hand, you can't have Metro in each country be completely different, because then coordinating across the different examples would be exceedingly different from headquarters in Dusseldorf in Germany. And so there's that balance that we constantly strive for. And the map of institutional voids is a very simple anchoring point, so to speak, for beginning that strategy formulation and understanding some of the challenges of executing it.
So what is the biggest mistake you see companies making when they're trying to get into emerging markets?
I think by far the most common would be an overestimation of the extent to which their experience is going to be useful in a new context. And I think that's a very human response. If you're a successful senior executive or a successful investor in one country, or one location, or one set of circumstances, chances are that you've gotten some confidence from that process, correctly gotten some confidence from that process. And there is what psychologists call biases of different sorts. I think they call it recency bias. So the recency of your experiences leads you to think that that's going to transfer over very well. And you see that all the time. People assume that the way they motivate employees in one place is likely to be the way they would motivate people in another. And at a very abstract level, that might be true. For instance, everybody likes to be appreciated. And at that level, of course, it's true in every location. But the way you express that appreciation might be completely different depending on the forms of compensation that are available to you, the extent to which you could use equity-linked incentives versus profit sharing, the union restrictions that might kick in different places. And so the closer you get to Monday morning reality, the more you realize that the abstract idea that everybody likes to be appreciated is going to have to be acted out very differently depending on the institutional circumstances. And I think failing to appreciate up front that there are these very robust, and by robust I mean several decade-long, differences in the context, in the most nitty-gritty things, is what trips people up.
Okay. And then you're touching on something that we haven't even gotten to because we've been talking about strategy and execution, but you're talking now about the human element too.
Yes, the human element I think is the underpinning of the entire story. That ultimately the institutions that we find ourselves embedded in are created by human beings. Right? They're the result of a little bit of history, a little bit of regulation, a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of conscious design, a little bit of happenstance and experimentation, a bunch of different stuff that kicks in, and human beings concoct the circumstances that they find themselves in. Look at what we're going through in our country right now with Mr. Obama and healthcare and reshaping pension schemes and worrying about an aging workforce. These are all ultimately human interactions that shape the institutions that will be both enablers and constraints for our entrepreneurs going forward. And the same is true in India, South Africa, Brazil, etc.
Something important to remember. Tarun, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it.
That's Harvard Business School professor Tarun Khanna, and the book is Winning in Emerging Markets, a roadmap for strategy and execution. For more, go to hbr.org.